10. For our last story, I would like to return to the problem of the negative mother complex on a deeper level. It is the problem of relating to a feminine aspect of the Godhead in its numinous and sometimes dark side. The positive half of the antique Great Mother has been partly integrated into the figure of the Virgin Mary. Many other aspects of the Great Mother have been lost, but they reappear in certain fairy tales. Vassilisa the Beautiful. Synopsis of the tale. In an empire, in a faraway country, there once lived a merchant and his wife, and their one beautiful daughter called Vassilisa. When the child was 8 years old, the wife suddenly became very ill. She called Vassilisa to her deathbed, gave her a doll, and said, "Listen, my dear, these are my last words, and don't forget them. I am dying and leave you my blessing and this doll. Keep it always with you, show it to nobody, and whenever you are in any trouble, ask it for advice." Then she kissed her daughter for the last time and died. The merchant mourned his wife for a long time, but then decided to marry again and chose a widow with 2 daughters. But for his daughter Vassilisa, the marriage was a disappointment, for the new wife was a real stepmother who gave her all the hard work to do, hoping that the sun and wind would spoil her beauty, and that she would begin to look like a peasant girl. But Vassilisa bore everything without grumbling and became more beautiful every day, while her stepsisters got thinner and uglier all the time because of their envy, though they sat still with their hands in their laps all day. The doll, however, always comforted Vassilisa and did a lot of the work for her. A year passed in this way, but Vassilisa, though much sought after her, was forbidden to marry before her stepsisters, whom nobody looked at. Then the merchant had to go away to another country. In his absence, the stepmother moved to a house at the edge of a great forest. In this same forest, there was a little house in a clearing in which the Baba Yaga lived. The Baba Yaga permitted nobody to approach, and anyone who did she ate up. The stepmother, for whose plans the new house stood in exactly the right place, always sent Vassilisa into the wood, but she always returned safely, thanks to the doll. One autumn evening, the stepmother gave the 3 girls work to do. One had to knit, and the other to embroider. Vassilisa had to spin. The stepmother then put out the fire, left a small light burning so that the girls could see to work, and went off to bed. The candle burned down, and the stepsisters took her knitting needle to clean the wick, and in so doing deliberately put it out. But one daughter said she didn't need any light. Her knitting needles gave enough. And the other said that her embroidery needle gave her enough light too, but that Vassilisa must go to the Baba Yaga and fetch fire, and they pushed her out of the room. The latter went to her room and fed her doll as usual, and told her about going to the wood. The doll told her not to be afraid, but to take her along and nothing bad would happen. Although terrified, Vassilisa put the doll in her pocket, crossed herself, and went into the wood. Suddenly a man in a white rode by on a white horse, and day came. Further on, a man in red by on a red horse, and the sun rose. All through the night and the next day, Vassilisa walked through the wood, and in the evening came to a hut surrounded by a hedge made of human bones with skulls stuck on the posts. The doors were made with bones, the bolt to the door of a human arm, and in place of the lock there was a mouth with grinning teeth. Vassilisa was almost senseless with horror and stood rooted to the spot. Then, suddenly, another rider came by, this time all in black and sitting on a black horse. He jumped off and opened the door and disappeared as though swallowed up by the ground, and it was black as night. But soon, all the eyes in the skulls that made the hedge began to twinkle, and it was as light as day in the clearing. Vassilisa trembled with fear, but didn't know where to go and stood still. Then the trees began to rustle, and the Baba Yaga appeared sitting in a mortar, steering with a pestle, and and wiping out her tracks with a broom. When she reached the door, she sniffed and cried out that it smelled like Russians and asked who was there. "I am, grandmother. My stepsister sent me to you to fetch the fire." "Good," said the Baba Yaga. "I know you. Stay with me for a bit, and then you shall have the fire." So they went in together. The Baba Yaga lay down and told Vassilisa to bring her everything that was in the oven to eat. There was enough there for 10, but the Baba Yaga ate everything up and left only a crust of bread and a little soup for Vassilisa. Then she said, "Tomorrow when I go out, you must sweep up the yard, sweep out the hut, cook the midday meal, do the washing, then go to the corn shed and sort out all the mildewed corn from the good seed. Everything must be done by the time I get home, for otherwise I shall eat you." When the Baba Yaga began snoring in bed, Vassilisa gave the doll the food she had and told her of the hard work she had to do. But the doll said she should eat the food herself and not be afraid, yet say her prayers and go to bed, for the morning was cleverer than the evening. In the morning when Vassilisa woke up, the eyes and the skulls were just shutting. The white rider ran by and the day came. The Baba Yaga whistled, and the pestle and mortar and broom appeared. The red rider rode by, and the sun came up. When the Baba Yaga had gone, Vassilisa was left quite alone, and troubled as to which work she should begin. But it was all done, and the doll was just removing the last seeds of the mildewed corn. Vassilisa called the doll her savior, saying it had saved her from great misfortune, and the doll told her that now she only had to cook the dinner. When evening came, Vassilisa laid the table and waited, and when the Baba Yaga came, she asked if everything was done. "Look yourself, grandmother," said Vassilisa. The Baba Yaga looked at everything and was furious not to be able to find any fault, but she only said, "Yes, it's all right," and then called on her faithful servants to grind her corn. Thereupon 3 pairs of hands appeared and began to sort out the grain. The Baba Yaga ate just as much as the evening before, and then told Vassilisa she should do the same work the next day, but in addition, she should sort the poppy seeds in the granary and clean the dirt away. Again, Vassilisa asked the doll, who told her to do the same as the evening before, and next day, the doll did everything Vassilisa was supposed to do. When the old woman came home, she looked everything over and then again called to her faithful servants. The 3 pairs of hands came and removed the poppy seeds and pressed the oil. When the Baba Yaga was eating her meal, Vassilisa stood silently beside her. "What are you staring at without speaking a word?" asked the Baba Yaga. "Are you dumb?" "If you will allow me to do so, I would like to ask some questions," said Vassilisa. "Ask," said the Baba Yaga, "but remember that not all questions are wise. Much knowledge makes one old." Vassilisa said she would only like to ask about the riders. The Baba Yaga told her that the first was her day, the red her sun, and the black her night. Then Vassilisa thought of the 3 pairs of hands, but didn't dare to ask and kept silent. "Why don't you ask more?" said the Baba Yaga. "That's enough," said Vassilisa. "You said yourself, grandmother, that too much knowledge made people old." The Baba Yaga then said that she was wise only to ask about what she saw outside the hut, but that now she would like to ask her questions, and she asked how Vassilisa had managed all the work. Vassilisa said that her mother's blessing helped her. "Is that so?" said the Baba Yaga. "Then get out of here. I don't want any blessing in my house." She pushed Vassilisa out of the room and out of the door, and took a skull from the hedge with the burning eyes in it, and put it on a pole and gave it to Vassilisa, saying, "Here is your fire for your stepsisters. Take it home with you." So Vassilisa hurried away, and by the evening of the next day arrived and thought she would throw the skull away. But a voice came from it saying she should not do so, but should take it to her stepmother. And because Vassilisa saw no light in the house, she did just that. For the first time, the stepmother and her stepsisters came to meet her in a friendly way and told her they had had no fire since she left, that they had not been able to light any fire, and what they fetched from the neighbor was extinguished as soon as it got to the room. "Perhaps your fire won't go out," said the stepmother. She took the skull into the living room, but the glowing eyes stared unceasingly into hers, and her daughter's eyes right down into their souls. They tried to hide, but the eyes followed them everywhere, and by the morning they were burned to ashes. When day came, Vassilisa buried the skull, shut up the house, went into the town, and asked a lonely old lady to let her stay with her until her father came home, and so she waited. One day she told the woman that she was bored with nothing to do, and that she should buy her some thread and she would spin. But the thread which Vassilisa spun was so uneven and was so thin and fine as silk hair that there was no machine fine enough to weave it. So Vassilisa asked the doll for advice. In one night the doll got a beautiful machine, and in the spring when the cloth was finished, Vassilisa gave it to the old woman and told her to sell it and keep the money. The old woman took it to the royal castle, where the king noticed it and asked how much she wanted for it. She said nobody could pay for that work, and that she had brought it as a present. The king thanked her, gave her presents, and sent her away, but no tailor could be found to make the stuff into shirts, for it was too fine. So the king called the old woman and said that since she had spun and woven the cloth, she should be able to make the shirts. Then she told him a young and beautiful girl had made it. The king said the girl should make the shirts, so Vassilisa made a dozen of the finest shirts, and the old woman brought them to the king. Meanwhile, Vassilisa washed herself and combed her hair and put on her best clothes and waited by the window. Presently, a servant came from the court and said that His Majesty wanted to see the artist who had made the shirts, so that he could reward her with his own hands. Vassilisa followed the servant to the palace and appeared before the king. When he saw the beautiful Vassilisa, he fell in love with her and said he would not be separated from her. She should be his wife. He took her hands and put her on the throne, and they were married the same day. Soon Vassilisa's father came home from his travels, rejoiced over her good fortune, and from then on stayed with his daughter. Vassilisa also brought the old woman to the palace, and the doll she kept with her to the end of her life. This story is much richer than the German and other Cinderella versions. The dramatis personae are the merchant, his wife, and their only daughter. The wife dies when the daughter is 8 years old. In fairy tales, the age of 14 or 15 is often an important age for a girl, since it is a transition stage and the end of early childhood. But here the fatal change takes place when the mother is replaced by a stepmother. In general, ruling persons in fairy tales represent dominance of collective consciousness, and the heroes are often princes or poor peasant people. But this time, there's a kind of average bourgeoisie milieu, so we can take this father figure as the average collective spirit. The father does not play a great role. He is neither good nor bad and appears only at the beginning and at the end, where the problem does not seem to be very concentrated. The whole drama takes place in the feminine realm. The merchant's wife dies suddenly, as shown by the fact that she has no name or title. She would represent the average feminine type in life, the habitual type repeated over and over again in a country. There are always women who live the average life in various forms, but here there is suddenly an accident, and the life which collapses and cannot function anymore is replaced by something magical, that is, the mother's blessing and the helpful doll. In the German version of Cinderella, the mother dies and is buried. On her grave grows a tree on which there is a bird, or from which there comes a voice which helps the girl, so she gets all she requires from the tree. In an Irish version, she finds a tortoiseshell cat that gives her everything she needs. The general motif is that after death of the positive mother figure, something supernatural and numinous survives, that is, the ghost of the mother enters into an animal or an object and is incorporated there. In primitive countries, ancestral ghosts are often incorporated in fetishes and so carry on with their helpful functions. What does it mean when a human being is replaced by a cat, a tree, or a doll? Archetypal content sometimes appear in humans and sometimes in other shapes, only if they approach consciousness. Then they come in human form. Human personification of the content of the unconscious shows that it can be integrated on the human level. One has a kind of feeling or vague idea as to what it could be. When an animus figure appears as a human being in a dream, you know that it can be dealt with, more or less, and you can usually make the working hypothesis that the dreamer has a general idea as to what it could be. But if there is a destructive voice coming from a grave, which would also be a personification of the animus, you would say that she could not deal with that, for it is removed and relatively autonomous, and is therefore more powerful, and has not yet entered the field of consciousness. The death of the archetypal figure is its transformation, for archetypes in themselves cannot die. They are eternal, instinctive, inherited dispositions. However, they can change one form of symbolic appearance for another. If they lose their human shape, it means they do not function anymore in a form which can easily be integrated into human life. Here the positive mother aspect of the little girl dies, but there remains with her the doll, representing the deepest essence of the mother figure, though not the human side. Most daughters have a certain archaic identity with their mother if they have a positive relationship with her, especially in childhood when the child talks to her doll as the mother talks to her, even repeating the mother's voice and words. Many women with a positive mother complex arrange the linen, cook for the family, and decorate the Christmas tree as a mother did, even educating the children in the same way. That creates a continuity of the same form of life, with the idea that everything goes smoothly and life goes on. But it has the disadvantage of preventing the individuation of the daughter, who continues the positive feminine figure as a type, not as an individual, and cannot realize her specific difference from her mother. If the mother dies, that means, symbolically, a realization that the daughter can no longer be identical with her, though the essential positive relationship remains. Therefore, the mother's death is the beginning of the daughter's process of individuation. The daughter is confronted with the task of finding her own femininity in her own form, which entails going through all the difficulties of finding it. The archaic mother-daughter identity is broken off, and Vassilisa realizes her weakness. Again and again, it is the great problem in feminine psychology. Women, even more than men, tend to identify with their own sex and to remain in this archaic identity. In a girls' school, for instance, one girl copies the other's new hairstyle or way of talking. They are like a flock of sheep, all of the same type. As far as I know, from what I have read, the same thing seems to be true in primitive villages. The archaic participation mystique has a great impact on women, who in general are more interested in eros, in relationship, and are identical with each other and swim along together. The fact that they have trouble in disidentifying accounts perhaps for a certain bitchiness among women. Because they are so apt to identify, they may line each other behind their backs, being unconscious of their own unique personality. They indulge in all such tricks in order to make a separation. In the Swiss mountains there exists a relationship between doll and ghosts in the spook known as Dogali or Togali, little doll. The lonely man in the mountain who lives with no woman around is oppressed by the Togali, which comes in by the keyhole and sits on his chest and suffocates him, and he wakes up with a nightmare and aroused sexual feelings. The doll here personifies a primitive anima and sexual desires and fantasies. The same Togali sometimes comes as the haunting spook. It also comes through the keyhole and makes little rapping noises. There you have the same relationship between doll and ghost as in this Russian story. The basic archetypal idea is the same as that of the fetish, which you meet up with all over the world. Usually the doll is regarded as the projection of the child's fantasy of having children. If you watch little girls playing, they initiate the whole mother-child relationship. But this seems not to be the only aspect of the doll, for in an earlier stage of childhood it is more an object which contains the divinity. Many little children between 2 and 4 cannot sleep without perhaps the washcloths near the pillow, or a little teddy bear, or some kind of fetish, which has to be in a certain place. For instance, the child cannot sleep and is exposed to the dangers of the night. It is not yet the child's child, like the doll, but it is the child's god. It is like the soul stones of the Stone Age men. In those days, people made so-called caches, some of which have been found in Switzerland. A hole was made in the ground, stones of a special shape were collected, and a nest was made in which they were kept. The place was kept secret and was a symbol of the person's individual secret power. Australian Aborigines still have such caches. In the Easter Islands, Thor Heyerdahl, after slowly becoming intimate with the population, discovered that some families had a key hidden under a stone that opened a door down into the earth. But only one member of the family knew of this hole in the earth, or cache, in which were stone carvings of the most different things, some of them recent and not particularly artistic, but others were beautiful old imported Indian sculptures, as well as stones of different regions and a number of animal sculptures. Lobster fishers had a beautiful stone lobster, which, if rightly kept, provided the lobsters a kind of hunting magic. Formerly, such stones used to be washed and brushed 4 times a year. The owners waited until nobody was around, then took the stones out and cleaned them, spread them on the sands to dry, and then hid them away again. When the man who had the secret died, another member of the family was always initiated, though not necessarily the eldest son, perhaps even a nephew. There you see the original meaning of the magic object, which has the divine power and guarantees the survival of the clan. These stones are a symbol of the self. They represent the secret eternity and uniqueness, and the secret of the essence of the life of the human being. The early relationship of the child with the doll, or with the washcloth, carries the earliest projections of the self. It is the magic object on which the life of the child depends, and by which it keeps its own essence, and therefore it is an awful tragedy if it is lost. Later on, it turns more into the parent-child play. The archaic identity between mother and daughter is the unconscious foundation from which the individuation of both begins. This is at the bottom of a major problem which I have met with in several cases in my practice. I have had to analyze mothers who could not get away from their daughters, and daughters who could not get away from their mothers. They could not detach, and there were constant quarrels. The daughter's marriage made no difference, and that the daughter had left home was no help. The problem could go on to any age. In the second half of life, the mother usually cannot get to her own work and creativity and does not know why. The daughter is out of the house, and she has the time, but somewhere there is sand in the machinery. One of the mothers in such a case had the following dream. She saw a big potato and a smaller one attached to it. Just as in oranges, there is sometimes a small orange inside, which can happen in any fruit. Out of the potato, at the joint between the two, came a pole with a crucified snake around it. This winged snake had a crown on its head with a light coming from it. It was a kind of tree of life symbol and very impressive. But at the bottom were these 2 potatoes in the earth. The mother was tortured over the problem of her daughter, who seemed to be going the wrong way in life. She tried constantly to have it out with her. The 2 would talk and cry together, but to no effect. According to the dream, something is not right. The potatoes are in the earth and still attached to each other, yet the tree of life is growing. The process of individuation is developing in a bad spot, in a place of evil, where something is tied and the borders are not clear. There is such a basic archaic identity of mother and daughter that a superhuman effort has to be made for them to get away from each other, and only then can each one become completely conscious of her own personality. Both must take back all their projections and become individuals themselves, and that is very difficult for all women. You hear of mothers eating their sons, but in many cases they are in a worse way tied up with their daughters. It is a natural phenomenon and a typically feminine problem. In such cases, one always finds that the mother has projected a symbol of the self onto her daughter, and since the daughters represent the self for her, she cannot get out the projection. In a woman's psychology, the self is represented by an older or a younger woman. Just as for men, there is the older man or younger man, the senex and puer, the godfather and godson, the father and the boy, the oldest and the youngest. The image of the eternally old or the eternally young woman probably has to do with the timelessness of the self. If the self appears as a young person in a woman's unconscious productions, it means the newly and consciously discovered self. Then the self is my daughter, but insofar as the self was also always within me, the self is my mother and existed long before my ego consciousness. Feminine ego consciousness rests on the foundation of the self, which has always existed and is the eternal mother. Insofar as I discover the self within and let it enter completely naturally into my life, it is my daughter. That is why the self, like the father and son in male psychology, is represented by mother and daughter in feminine psychology. In the moment when Vassilisa receives this magic doll from her dying mother, instead of being identical with the mother, she begins to realize a germ of her own personality, the first hunch of the self, which one perhaps does get at about that age. It is the first initial realization of being a personality, though one cannot yet guess how it will take shape in one's own later life. The merchant then marries the witch with the two daughters, three jealous bitches who persecute the girl. This is an archetypal motif. Where the pearl is, there is also the dragon, and vice versa. They are never separate. Frequently, just after the first intuitive realization of the self, the powers of dissolution and darkness break in. A terrible slaughtering always takes place at the time of the birth of the hero, as for instance the killing of the innocents at Bethlehem when Christ was born. Some persecuting power starts at once to blot out the inner germ. Outwardly, it is often that the innermost kernel of the human being has an actually irritating effect upon outer surroundings. Realization of the self, when in statu nascendi, when only a hunch, makes a person unadapted and difficult for those around, for it disturbs the unconscious instinctive order. Jung often said that it is as if a flock of sheep resented it bitterly that one sheep wanted to walk by itself. In Germany, group psychology experiments have been made with hens and other birds. Hens and crows, for instance, observe a certain pecking order. There is the rooster and his first wife, who has first rights. The others have special rank in the order in which they may eat and build their nests. Most animals, and also apes, have an order which one calls the alpha, beta, gamma order. Some psychologists say that in a human group or in a crowd, people also try to peck at each other. The alpha hen is generally the most disgusting and pushy person, and the best in IQ are the gamma and delta hens. Clearly, wherever people form a group, there is this interplay of unconscious balance. However, if any one person gets just an idea of the self, he falls out of the group, and the balance has to be reestablished. Now that one factor is out, the others feel the gap and are naturally angry and try to force the miscreant to the former unconscious level. If you analyze one member of the family, usually the whole family begins to wobble and gets upset. Insofar as we are herd animals, we have within ourselves that essential conflict between the inertia, which wants to remain in the flock, and the disturbing factor, the possibility of individuation. A woman who gets the first hunch of the self is immediately attacked, not only by the stepmother outside, but from within, by the inner stepmother. That is the inertia of the old collective pattern of femininity, that regressive inertia which always pulls one back to do the thing in the least painful way. As in many other Cinderella stories, the stepsisters are characterized as lazy, and the heroine has to do tremendously hard work, such as separating grains, which entails a superhuman effort. There is the conflict between that which calls upon you to make the superhuman effort and the desire to follow the old pattern. As soon as the merchant leaves the country, the stepmother and her family move near the woods. That is, the stepmother regresses from the human way of functioning to the borders of vegetative unconsciousness. Women, much more than men, especially if they do not have the strong animus, vegetate in an amazing way. They can live 10 or 20 years like plants without either a positive or negative drama in their lives. They just exist. This is a typical form of feminine unconsciousness and means sinking into inertia, into doing things the easy way and just following the daily plan. That is known as the conservatism of woman. There is no conflict, but also no life. The stepmother here has a wish to push out Vassilisa, but she just goes to live near the woods and hopes the thing will happen. She has a plot and wants Vassilisa to be eaten by the Baba Yaga. That is the name for the archetypal witch in all Russian fairy tales. She is a great magician who can turn herself into a well, or a paradisical garden in which the hero is torn to pieces, to the size of a poppy seed. Or she turns into a gigantic sow that kills the hero. In our story, she is not completely evil, though when she hears that the girl is a blessed daughter, she tells her she does not want her in her house. In a hidden way, she is not thoroughly evil, and sometimes even helpful. She wonderfully portrays the Great Mother in her double aspect. There is a Russian story of the Maiden Tsar in which the Baba Yaga lives in a rotating little house standing on chicken feet, and you have to say a magic word before you can enter. The Tsar's son goes in and finds her scratching among the ashes with her long nose. She combs her hair and her claws and watches the geese with her eyes, and she asks the hero, "My dear little child, are you here by your own free will or by compulsion?" One of the great tricks of the mother complex in a man is always to implant doubt in his mind, suggesting that it might be better to do the other thing. Then the man is lamed. But the hero in the story says, "Grandmother, you should not ask such questions of a hero. Give me something to eat, and if you don't..." Whereupon the Baba Yaga goes and cooks him a marvelous dinner and gives him good advice, and it works. So it depends on the hero's attitude. She tries to make him infantile, but when she sees he is up to her, she helps him. So the Baba Yaga can be good or bad. Just as the male image of the godhead has usually a dark side, like the devil, so the image of the feminine godhead, which in female psychology would be the image of the self, has both a light and a dark side. Usually in Catholic countries, the light side is personified in the Virgin Mary. She represents the light side of the Great Mother, of the man's anima, and of the woman's self, but lacks the shadow. The Baba Yaga would represent a more archaic, similar figure in which the positive and negative are mixed. She is full of the powers of destruction, of desolation, and of chaos, but at the same time is a helpful figure. Viewed historically, she probably represents the surviving image of the late antique Greek Hecate, the queen of the underworld. In Hellenistic times, this goddess of Hades became more and more identified with the Neoplatonic world soul, and as such, she became the feminine spirit of the universe, a goddess of nature and of life as well as death, who was even praised as Soteria, the feminine savior. Her daughter was Persephone, with whom she was secretly identical. This throws a light on the heroine of our story, who is called Vassilisa. This is identical with the Greek Vassilisa, which means queen, and which was one of the titles of Persephone. Russian fairy tales have been deeply influenced from the south by the late Greek civilization, and thus we have in Baba Yaga and Vassilisa really a survival of the great cosmic goddesses Hecate and Persephone. The divine rank of the Baba Yaga is clearly proved by the fact that she has 3 riders at her disposition: my day, my night, and my sun. So she is a cosmic godhead. There are also 3 pairs of hands which sort out the grain, that unspeakable, horrible secret no one ought to ask about. The 3 hands are probably the secret of complete destruction or death. The Baba Yaga sits in a mortar, steers with a pestle, and with a broom blurs or extinguishes all her traces. Human witches like to do the same thing with the famous hush hush technique. For God's sake, do not mention me. Mother Nature likes to hide herself, it is said in Greek philosophy. The mortar and pestle are important symbols in this story. The mortar as a vessel, naturally, is a feminine symbol. The Virgin Mary is called the vessel of grace, and the Holy Grail has also been applied to the Virgin Mary. The Baba Yaga too has a round vessel in which substances are ground to powder. She sits in a vessel that serves to pulverize matter. In alchemical literature, the basic fantasy of the alchemist was that at bottom there is one ultimate, basic material of the universe on which all the rest is built up. This is still the working hypothesis for many physicists. The idea of a basic building material which would unify the whole of nature, and by means of which one could get to the root of the phenomena of the universe. This hunt for the basic material has always haunted the human mind, and particularly the natural scientists. It is, so to speak, God's own secret. It was the material with which he built up reality, and therefore is divine, or contains a divine secret. In former times, before the splitting of the atom, the way of getting such a basic material was to burn everything to ashes and call that the basic material, or to pulverize it to the finest dust in a mortar. And the idea was that that was the prima materia, the most elemental basic element of matter. The Latin verb terro means to grind, and from it is derived a very interesting word used in Christian theology, namely castrito, contrition. If you realize your sins, you feel remorse and penitent. If you get to the bottom and feel annihilated by your sins, then you are reduced to ashes and pulverized and are in a state of contrition, which would be the deepest kind of remorse, which has the highest merit. By contrition you can be healed of all your sins. It is a realization of the shadow which goes so deep that one can say nothing more in one's own favor. As in all highly disagreeable situations, it has the advantage that you are at the bottom of the hole and cannot fall lower. Therefore, it is the turning point. The ego in the negative aspect has been pulverized, has reached the end of the selfish willfulness, and has to give in to greater powers. The Baba Yaga has this instrument of contrition, the pestle and mortar. Therefore, she symbolizes that life power which, with its ultimate truth, will bring the human being to its own ultimate truth. Hence, her archaic connection with the principle of death. Many people keep a little bit above the truth and reach this stage of complete contrition only when they have to face death. We are like corks. When God does not depress us too much, we float on the surface. But when death approaches, people suddenly shut up and sink down to something more substantial. On the deathbed, their expression changes, and for the first time you feel that they are quiet and really themselves, and that all the fuss of the ego has to come to an end. So the Baba Yaga is also the demon of death. She begins this ultimate contrition. She is the great alchemist who reduces everything superficial to its essence. In our story, the Baba Yaga goes to sleep, leaving the girl to select the good from the bad grain. This is a theme to be found in many Cinderella fairy tales, and appears also in the ancient story of Amor and Psyche. It is a typical task in mythology for the heroine. Separating the good from the bad grains is a work of patience, which can neither be rushed into nor speeded up. The Greek word krino means to discriminate, to make a distinction between A and B. It is a work of careful, detailed feeling judgments, but not discrimination as done by the male logos. When the latter is confronted with chaos, he says, "Let's find a mathematical formula," and the like. That is the bird's eye view of the logos principle. It does not look at details. The feminine principle also has its way of seeing clearly, but it requires it in a different psychological way, more by the selection of innumerable details, showing that this is this and that is that. For women, it is important to go into things in detail, to see, for instance, how and where a misunderstanding began, for this is frequently caused by a lack of clarity. By working it out in detail, the grains are selected. In a problem of relationship, one has to do this all the time. boring as it is often, and gossipy as it seems, a psychological problem cannot be worked out without all these little details. Some women like to be a little unclear, giving rise in that way to those marvelous witch muddles where nobody knows what is what anymore. That is the famous way by which women get into their shadow troubles. Jung always said that women love to be unclear even about a rendezvous, and to add something such as, "If I am not there, ring up so-and-so." They make a vague arrangement, then a big scene if a thing does not work. Men do it also, but women much more. The shadow cannot intervene if one is precise. I can give you an example. A daughter has a pair of ski shoes she cannot wear anymore. The old mother thinks the other daughter should have them. Then the daughter-in-law comes in and tries them on, but she says they are too big. The old mother suggests wearing socks inside, but they are still too big. The old thinks that the daughter-in-law has refused them and tells the other daughter to take them, but they cannot be found. The daughter-in-law has taken them with her. Then the son has to defend his wife, and there is a general family battle because all these ladies did not take the trouble to be clear as to what they meant. The daughter-in-law seemed to refuse them, but went off with them. At the back of such things there is a participation mystique among the women. So the process of becoming conscious for a woman is that within herself, she has to become clear about her positive and negative reactions and know where they are, instead of making a lot of muddles and half muddles. That is a superficial aspect of a very deep problem. The old mother had not come to terms with the mother archetype, promising the ski shoes first to one daughter and then to her daughter-in-law, and then leaving it all undecided is just laziness in relationship. The insidious thing at the back of it is that, as a mother, she does not function rightly, and therefore creates muddles. If you go further into this, in itself a silly instant, you will see that there is a kind of uncertainty of instinct. She didn't know whom to mother, or whose needs to answer or not answer, and she wasn't clear about the feeling needs of the other women and the necessity of holding the family together. All that was, in the deepest sense, uncertain in her. Such a woman has sacrificed much too much of her private needs and life to her family, and consequently hates the family somewhere, which is often expressed in the form of symptoms. For example, one mother got diarrhea and had to go to a sanatorium, and her dreams quite clearly said that she was once again sick of the whole lot. But the only way she knew of pulling out was by retiring to the sanatorium. She always put on this unconsciously deliberate pretense at the worst possible moment, namely, just when the family needed her. That is a part of the devilish mechanism. Thus, behind the superficial vagueness, if one digs deep enough, one generally finds a very great problem constellated. Therefore, when the witch gives Vassilisa this task of sorting grain, it is as though she makes a test, saying that if the girl can make the right selection, she would not fall into the witch's power.